Hello and welcome to the Habit Coach podcast. I'm Ashdin Doctor, your habit coach, and today with us we have Dr. Nicole Byers. Now, this is the second episode. It is going to be a little different from the first episode, so you can listen to this, but do make sure you go listen to the first part later. We're going to be talking about neuroscience and understanding how the brain works with habits, works with procrastination, and our willpower. So let's have an interesting podcast. Enjoy. When people talk about trying to make a change, and I've tried and I've failed, I don't have the willpower. I don't
Mhm.
have what is it? Is willpower something to do with the brain trying to maintain its own old routine? Is willpower something else? Because they
Yeah,
blame themselves.
totally, which is probably unfortunate because what that also does is when we have an experience like that and we're not successful, it also sends feedback to our brain, right? And so now
Okay.
my brain says, "Oh, I tried this and it didn't work. That also felt terrible. That didn't feel very good. So I am going to be less likely to want to try again in the future, even if at a conscious level, I really want to try this. I really want to make this new habit work. My brain's going to have even more resistance because it had that experience of failure." So I think a lot of times what we think of in terms of willpower is really just that resistance that our brain has and that kind of frustration cycle that we get into when we have these unsuccessful attempts in the past. And that's another great reason to have that slow and steady approach, to start out small, because the more successes that we have, the easier it's going to be for our brain to take action in the future, because our brain's going to say, "Oh, that worked really well. Let me try this again," versus, "Oh, that was a horrible experience. I'm never going to do this again in the future."
So Dr. Bias, you said something very interesting. It says that the brain says, "Oh, this doesn't feel so good," right? And wants to. Is there a way of attaching feel good to a habit to make it stick? Is a feel good a way in which the brain likes to learn?
Yes, absolutely. Fantastic question. Yes, our brains love to feel good. That is
All right.
very reinforcing for our brains. So they want to do things that feel comfortable, make us feel good, make us feel positive. So another great way to make a habit more likely to succeed is to think about, how can I reward myself for this habit? Rewards are fantastic for our brains. Sometimes rewards get, I think, just a bad reputation. We feel like we shouldn't have to reward ourselves for doing something healthy. For example, it's
Right.
like, "Oh, I should just want to get up and go for a run every day." But no, that's not how our brains work, right? If you have never gone for a run before, your brain's not going to want to get up and go for a run because it's going to feel awful the first few
Yeah.
times, right? And so another way we can boost that momentum and make our brains less likely to put up that resistance is to have some type of reward in place. And those rewards can be small. For example, if you want to start getting up and having a meditation routine, maybe after you start with 5 minutes a day of meditation, and then after that you do something fun that you like to do for a couple of minutes. Maybe you let yourself go, read or go grab a coffee or do something else. And so having a positive experience um, after that new habit that we're trying to start can really reinforce that behavior, because our brain says, "Okay, I did this thing. It didn't feel that comfortable, but I got this good thing after. Okay, maybe I'll keep doing it," until we get to that point where we don't need that reward anymore, where it's become that habit and you get that enjoyment already from it. Does that make sense?
Just from doing that habit. Yep. So you don't
Mm-hmm.
need that external thing on it. In fact, I'll give you an example. I started my morning meditation practice by first having a gratitude diary, and I associated the gratitude diary with my morning coffee. So I know I was going to feel good with the coffee, and then that feel good got associated with the gratitude,
Mm-hmm.
and the gratitude journal then felt good with the meditation, and that's how I slowly built this up. Because you can't just cut copy paste somebody's morning routine or routines into your life. You have to slowly build them up, like you said, and make sure each of them feels good along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. And because our brain is also much more likely to do things when we feel good, right?
Mm.
When we are not in a great mood, when we're not feeling fantastic, that pulls a lot of our brain resources as well. So if we're forcing ourselves to do something that's not going to feel good, our brain is going to be more tired, it's going to be drained more quickly, and it's going to be, again, less likely to continue with that activity because it didn't feel good. Especially for a lot of the time when we talk about starting new habits, we're looking at habits that have long term goals. So we don't feel the benefit right away. So if I get up and meditate, it might feel good right away, but really we're looking at long-term benefits for a daily meditation practice or a daily exercise practice or a daily healthy eating practice. I don't, I eat the apple, I don't feel amazing right after that. I do feel really good if I eat the apple pie right after
Correct.
it, right? And so we're having
Absolutely.
to we're having to overcome that in our brain, is that, the habit that we're wanting to change usually has immediate rewards. Usually it feels good to do the thing we're already doing, and we're adding something that doesn't feel as good. So if we can attach that to an activity that already has that intrinsic good feeling, or we can add something else to make it feel good after, like a reward, we're really going to increase our chances of success.
And when you say feel good, it is what kind of, like, is it a hormone? Is it a neurotransmitter? What is it that is actually working? So I know dopamine is a great reward system, but the others that I feel good are serotonin, oxytocin. Are there others? How would you map those out for us?
Yeah, it kind of really depends on the system that's activated. But you're right, dopamine is kind of a happy neurotransmitter for us that makes us overall feel good, and that's the one we're looking at a lot of times here as well. But yes, definitely, it's at that neurotransmitter level is really what releases those reward neurotransmitters into our brain and makes us feel a lot better, and it triggers a lot of those systems that make us feel happy, right? That make us feel
Right.
accomplished, that make us feel like we're doing something positive. And those systems that we talked about that then trigger in response because everything starts to feel better and to feel more positive.
So it is basically these neurotransmitters that will help us form our habits. If I can boil it down to something that we, so if you're
Yes.
not feeling good doing that habit, don't do it, because it's just not gonna stick. Try doing something else that will trigger something happy in you, that'll trigger a feel good hormone or feel good aspect, and hopefully that'll make the habit stick.
Yeah, totally. And I think a lot of times we feel like we should do certain habits, and that's part of the problem is we feel like, well, going for a walk every day isn't enough. I feel like I should be doing more than this. And so we try to take on a habit that doesn't feel good. It doesn't match with, our values, our routines, who we are already. And so it's really just too much for our brain, right? If I have never exercised before regularly and I decide I'm going to start going to the gym every day for an hour, that's just a lot of pressure to put on our brain, and it's not going to feel good right away. So yes, finding habits that feel good and are also good for us is really the path to success.
Yeah. um, like, I'll give you another example of a way that I form my walking habit. So I used to just sit down and watch TV after dinner, and I said, "There's no point in this. Let me go for a walk." And I would play my audiobook with that, and my audiobook, I think, gives me that feeling of seeking for what is going to come next, right? It is that same, that searching feeling that comes from it, for me especially. So it was associated with walking at that point of time. So I wasn't necessarily going and enjoying the walk, but I was enjoying the audiobook when I was doing that, and that's how I successfully created my walking routine.
Yeah,
Would that be a
that's
fair enough way of?
absolutely. That is a great idea. Yes. And if you can just like that, pair it in the moment, even, right, with something else that's enjoyable, so much more likely to succeed. I actually had a colleague suggest that to me a little while ago. I was, one of my soapboxes I like to get up on, we can talk about it in a little bit, is about how bad multitasking is for our
Oh,
brain and our
lovely. For
productivity. And,
sure.
and we can talk about that. But I was talking about how, we should don't multitask, don't do this. And then I had a colleague, he's like, oh, the one time I like to use multitasking is when I'm trying to get myself to do something I don't like to do.
Oh,
And so he does just
nice.
like you said, right? So really what you're doing is you're multitasking, right? So you're going for your walk and you're also listening to your audio book, and it's successful in that moment because otherwise you wouldn't go for the walk, right? I hate doing bookkeeping. It's my least favorite job as a business owner. And so I watch Netflix while I do my bookkeeping because I don't like doing my bookkeeping. I know it probably takes me longer to do it while I'm watching TV, but because I like watching the movie that I'm watching, it keeps me engaged. I stay working on my bookkeeping at least. And that's another way we can kind of use things that our brain likes to multitask, even though it's not a very good strategy for our brain. And so we can use that in a positive way to make those habits or make us, more likely to do those things that we really don't want to do in our day.
uh, do not watch bank robbery movies when you're doing your finances. You just like
Yeah.
add $4 million to something.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
just
Yeah. Yeah.
So, doctor, please get onto your soapbox for the multitasking. I love
Sure.
the fact that you're like, yes, I'm gung ho about this.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, so yes, so multitasking is one of those habits that we get into that is not so great for us. It's not great for our brains, it's not great for our productivity, it's not great for our mood, it's not great for our energy. It's not great because our brains can't really multitask in the way that we think we can multitask. Like, yes, I can walk and chew gum at the same time, but more complex tasks we can't actually do together. What our brain does is it shifts the focus back and forth from one task to another. So, for example, if I'm sitting in a meeting and I'm also checking my emails at the same time, my brain is using a lot of resources to shift my focus to the meeting, then back to my email, then to my meeting, and then back to my email. And that uses up a lot of energy for our brains because every time we do this, our brain has to refocus on the new task and then pull resources to shift focus again. So it's very inefficient, very draining. But we live in a world where multitasking has become this really high value thing where we see job postings all the time that say must be an excellent multitasker, right? Where we feel like if we're not multitasking, we're not getting enough stuff done, right? I should be able to juggle 400 things at once. And it starts to feel uncomfortable just to try and focus on one thing. And part of that is there's a social aspect to that. Like I said, there are some values that we have learned in our modern world, in our culture of busy, that hustle culture that says you should be doing 400 things at once. And some of it is our brain as well, because our brains like novelty. They like new stimulation all the time. It keeps us engaged, it keeps us entertained. That's why social media apps can be so addicting because you're always seeing something new. And so our brains like to multitask, but they're not very good at it. And so it really can just get in our way when we're trying to get things done.
So, doctor, one thing that you said was that our brain likes that kind of stimulation. But is it good for the brain?
Yes and
So
no.
much stimulation. All
So
right,
much
sorry. All
no.
right.
So much
Hmm.
no. So yes, new things and new experiences, we already talked about this, are great for our brain.
Yeah.
But no, so much stimulation is not great for our brain, especially the stimulation that we're getting right now from gadgets and technology. And they have done research, for example, looking at people who regularly multitask with devices. So they're on their phones, sending texts and responding to emails and doing all of these things. They tend to be more stressed out than those who do not do that. They don't sleep as well. They are less productive. They get less done than people who focus on one task at a time. And actually, people who think they're good multitaskers tend to be worse multitaskers than other people. So we're also not a very good judge of actually how good we are at doing this. So it's not good for our brain. We're not good at estimating how well we do it. So we think we're better at it than we are. And it just gets into this bad cycle.
Yeah, it's a vicious loop, right? And I remember talking about, like when you create YouTube videos and content right now, it's almost as if you're constantly creating for somebody with attention deficiency disorder, right? You have to have something ping, you have to have something fly across the screen. You have to keep that engagement with the brain. And if the brain's not getting it, I've noticed that a lot of people find it very, are agitated by being
Yes.
calm.
Yes. And they've done some research on kids looking at video game usage in that way. And, finding that kids who tend to play more video games do tend to have more trouble staying focused. The flip side of this is that there is also some research that with modern technology, we are becoming more creative and better at problem solving. So our brains are changing. Technology is changing us. Well, I guess we'll wait and see if it's for the better or for the worse overall. But yes, it's making it harder for us to stay focused on one thing. We get bored, like you said, and agitated very easily when we're trying just to do one thing at a time. We're not as good at remembering um, like knowledge-based data anymore because we can Google it, right? You don't need to
Yeah.
remember dates or names because you can just look it up. But there is an argument that that's freeing up a lot of our brain space to do more creative work, to do more problem-solving type work, to improve our kind of reflexes and responses in other ways. So there's kind of pros and cons. But yes, I'd say overall that we should be cautious about how much we're consuming media, how much time we're spending on devices, because there are definitely some negative implications for our brain health and our emotional health too. I think that's maybe another component of it too, is when we talk about our brain also controls all of our emotions, right?
Oh,
And if
very
we,
big, yes.
yes, and if we are staring at a screen all day, not having that social connection that we used to have, if we are always on because there's always something new pulling our attention, that drains our emotions as well.
And there's emotional drain and there's energy drain, like you mentioned this. What is it that the brain feels the most? Like, is there something that the brain feels faster? That, when we feel like we've had a hard day or a long day,
Mm.
is it an emotional drain? Is it an energy drain that gets us?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of both. It's probably what it is they're interacting, right? So when I have less energy, my brain also has less resources to put towards managing my emotions. That's why it's very common when we're overtired or we've had a busy day that we're more cranky, we're more irritable, we're more quick to come to tears or to cry as well, because our brain prioritizes resources, and it's really going to prioritize your basic needs first, which is keeping you breathing, keeping you walking, keeping you upright and talking, right? Less resources are going to be left over for things like keeping your emotions in check, for staying focused on what you need to do, for remembering what you did yesterday. All of those are going to be lower priority activities for your brain. So as our brains start to run out of resources towards the end of the day, we're going to be more fatigued. There's going to be that emotional drain with it. And then all of that just interacts together to increase that fatigue.
While you were talking, I was just thinking, and I don't know if you would, like, if this is studied or something. It was just a thought that came. Like, when we think about our brain fatigue, is it, like our brain has run out of ATP in that context, like the energy, or has it been just overwhelmed in the form of its receptors? Like, for example, like when we have caffeine and our adenosine receptors have gone for a toss, right? What would this actual fatigue be? Would any research have been done on this aspect?
Yeah, fatigue is a bit hard to study. That's a great question, because I think there are so many components to it. You're right. There is a basic biological level of fatigue, but there is also that emotional, cognitive fatigue too. And there is physical fatigue for our
Correct.
bodies, because sometimes we can be, our brains are exhausted, but our bodies are okay, or the opposite, right? I run a marathon and my body's exhausted. I have a day with a ton of meetings, my brain is exhausted. And sometimes it's both. At the basic cell level, yes, we can kind of fatigue those cells. For example, if you've ever noticed that you're trying to think of someone's name, maybe the name of like a famous person or a movie actor, and you're like, you can't think of it. And then 2 hours later, you're driving home and out of nowhere, that name comes to you,
Yes.
right? You find it again. It's because what happens is when we're trying too hard to think about specific items, like a name like that, there is this process of competitive inhibition of those neurons. So basically, they are working too hard. They get all the surrounding neurons around that information you're trying to pull out, get burnt out, and they need some time to recharge. So yes, at a very basic level, there is some of that overwork happening, but also at a broader level, a whole brain level, there is a fatigue that happens when we've made too many complex decisions and our brains are burnt out, or we've had a very emotional or trying day. That is going to burn out the whole brain as well.
Wow, fantastic. I love the way this whole system works together.
Hello, everybody. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Advertising is Dead, It's All Business, Varun is joined by Anurag Jain, co-founder of Clubworks. He takes us on his entrepreneurial journey and his approach to revenue-based finance. On Don Baika Gappa Aika, Avanti and Aparna discuss why the younger generation is more inclined towards live-in relationships. On Varta Lab, Akash and Naveen share some hilarious stories with their guest, stand-up comedian Aditi Mittal. On A Sip of Finance, Priyanka gives a perfect checklist to refer to when buying health insurance. And on Think Fast, Varun and Sachita talk about crypto firms being accused of money laundering. Once again, I'd like to remind you all, please do check out our merch. It's available on IVM Podcast website. Go click the shop tab and you'll be able to see our first collections of t-shirts. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Remember, we got a bunch of YouTube channels as well, and if you want to check that out, go to our website, ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. We have a list of all those channels. And remember, do tell a friend if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter. Word of mouth is one of the most important and best ways for us to get the word out about this podcast. Also, it's a way for you to have discussions about a podcast with your friends. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Boat Lifestyle, Checkpoint Software, Small Case, and Intel vPro. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Dr. Byers, I was watching your video on procrastination. Can you talk a little bit about that for us? Because I know that's a question that keeps coming up, and I would love to understand the neuroscience behind procrastination.
Yeah. And so really from a brain perspective, what procrastination often comes down to is our brain doesn't like change. It doesn't like to do things outside of our comfort zone. It doesn't want to use energy. And a lot of the things that we procrastinate on, our brain says, oh, that's going to take too much work, or that's going to be too hard, or I don't know how to do that. Or what if I do that and I mess up? Or what if I do that and I fail, or I make a mistake? And so our brain goes to these places, right? And it comes up with all of these stories to explain how this is going to be really hard or potentially really uncomfortable for us. And so our brain's like, no, thank you. That sounds awful. I don't want to do this. And so we get into that habit of procrastination. And procrastination can be really reinforcing then for our brain, because we say, oh, see, I procrastinated and I didn't have to deal with that. I felt better. Let's keep procrastinating, because in the moment, it feels really good, right? I don't have to deal with that report that I'm avoiding because I'm not sure how to do it, and I'm worried that I'm going to mess up or I'm not going to be good enough to do it. I can put it off into the future, even though my brain knows, I know that that's probably not a great long-term strategy. Kind of the front of my brain knows, that higher level process knows, but those deeper processes say, but right now it feels better to procrastinate. So I'm going to procrastinate, and this is a future Nicole problem. I will deal with this in the future at some other time.
Wow, that's evil.
It is, right? Yes.
How do you break out of that cycle? It's like, oh, this felt so good, don't do it. This felt so good, don't do it. Why are you doing it?
Yes. And so that's a great question. How do we break out of this? So one way is to get our brains focused on the long term. So right now our brains are focused on short term. So the short term risks of taking action, why I don't want to do this thing, and the short term benefits of procrastinating. It feels good right now. And so the more that we can get our brain to think about what are those long term consequences. So if I continue to procrastinate, well, I'm still going to have to do this, and I'm probably going to be rushed doing it. Well, if I take action now, that means I can do something else later, because when we're procrastinating, also it's still on the back of our mind, right? So we're still thinking about it, it's still pulling resources. So if we can get our brain to shift to focusing on those reasons that we actually want to stop procrastinating, the benefits of taking action, that can be really helpful. And that can be something as simple as journaling, right? If you are procrastinating on something, a big task at work, sitting down and making a column, why am I procrastinating? What am I worried about is going to happen? Other column, what are the benefits of taking action? What are the good things that could happen? And sometimes even just forcing our brain to have that perspective can be enough to give that little oomph to get you started. Because our brains are really good at focusing on the reasons to not change and ignoring all the reasons that we want to take action and stop procrastinating. So if we force them to pay attention to both, that can free up some space to take action.
So it's almost like a it's almost like a parent telling the child, saying that, if you do this, and are you like suggesting to the brain that this is better? It's interesting the way that you described it. Like, what is happening in the brain when you start thinking? Because it's actually the brain that's having the same thought that we should be doing it now, and it's the brain also having the same thought that you should not be doing this now.
Yes, that's right. And because it's different processes. So the I don't want to do it now is more of that automatic, that deeper, those more subcortical structures of our brain that are kind of like our older part of our brain. Sometimes people say like the reptilian part of your brain. That's not quite right. But I get what they mean by that, right? This is the automatic response, says, I don't want to do this. And then the higher level response says, actually, I do want to do this. But this one here is really strong because it's tied to all those emotions that we're talking about. And those emotional centers of our brain are really good at getting us to act or not act, because when they get activated, your brain goes into alarm mode and says, whoa, this is horrible. And so we need to calm that emotional reaction down, give our brain space to have more of an analytical problem solving approach to it, allow some space for that to come into play.
So it's almost that you remove the emotional aspect of the conversation itself and try and deep dive into the logical aspect.
Yeah,
It's
yeah. And
it's not that
sometimes,
you sorry.
so I was going to say, sometimes that's harder in practice, right? Again, because those emotions want to take the forefront. And so if we can tie emotions to the reason to change as well, that helps. So I'm going to feel better if I take action. I'm going to be less stressed if I take action. How is this going to feel for me if I stop procrastinating and do this thing? Sometimes that can help overcome that emotional resistance too.
And would feel good be a better driver, or would fear be a better driver? Like if I don't do this and fear, or if I do this and then I'm tension free,
Yeah.
which would be a better driver?
Fear. Usually fear. Fear is the
Just
stronger
get scared of
emotion
everything.
there. Yeah, yeah. And so we don't want to always be in that fear, but that is really what makes us change faster, right? That is the strongest response for our brain, because our brain does not like to feel afraid. It does not like to go into that fear response. And so thinking about some of those, we want to have a balanced approach. That is always the best. Think about the positives, but also the negatives, right? Here are the positive reasons to change. Here's the feel good reasons to change, but here's also the negative consequences if I don't change. And so having both of those is really going to be successful. But yes, the fear is going to motivate us more. That's what's keeping
Right?
us stuck. That's what's going to take us forward, right?
Yeah, it's all the stuff about the future, right? So like fear the future, and then now imagine if you did this, you will not be so scared. So do it. So it's almost like that. It's a story that you have to weave on how to actually go and get the stuff done to your
Yes.
brain. I
Yes.
love how you have to talk to it. It's I think I find it so cute as an idea. Um, Doctor, thank you so much for coming and sharing this with us. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that, in with regards to habits or procrastination or the way that we behave that I would have missed out?
No, I think maybe just to summarize, kind of the key thing to think about in terms of your brain is our brains only have so many resources, and where they put those resources matters. So right now, your brain puts a lot of resources into staying comfortable, staying right where you are, even if that place isn't that great. Even if up here, you want to change, your brain puts a lot of resources into keeping you where you are. So if we want to change, if we want to start a new habit, we need to make that easy for our brain. And we talked about some ways to make that easier with habit stacking or having rewards or positive connotations to those habits. And we want to reduce that resistance by kind of challenging some of those default places that our brains go and challenging those fears, like we talked about.
That's so beautiful. I love the way that you summarize this. Doctor, how can people get in touch with you? How can people understand what you're doing, and where all can they reach out to you?
Yeah, probably the best place to go is my website. It's just drnicolebyers.com. I have links to my blog and my podcast on there as well, and lots of free resources.
Fantastic. What is the name of the podcast so that people can search for this immediately and
Yeah.
start listening to you?
Sure. It's called The Bold Life. So it's a podcast for busy perfectionists and high achievers who want to be able to unlearn some of these mental habits that we're talking about that can keep us stuck and make us feel really overwhelmed day to day so we can achieve our goals.
I love that. The bold life.
Mhm.
What a nice life that is to lead,
Mhm.
right? Like
Yeah, I think so too.
boldly go.
Mhm.
In fact, I think a while back I'd done a podcast on this word bold because I realized that we don't use it enough. And I think bold is such a empowering word. I remember hearing it from the Star Trek shows where they said to boldly go where no man's
Yes.
gone before, right? And I love that vision of boldly going into life, and your podcast, I think it fits perfectly.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on the Habit Coach podcast. I had a blast geeking out with you.
Me too. Thanks.